American English, American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Welcome everyone to today's edition of the American English webinar series, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. My name is Katie, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Katie. You'll also see my friends Moderator Amy and Moderator Curtis in the chat box to help you today. I was wondering, everybody, if you liked the changes we made for this webinar series. Can you raise your hand if you liked our changes? This webinar series was called the American English Webinar Series, and instead of being 90 minutes long, our webinars were 60 minutes long. The webinar topics were related to the monthly American English Teachers Corner theme. And we're going to continue all of these features in 2016, so we hope that you liked all the changes we made during this series. And here's our schedule for American English Webinar Series number 2. It will begin on January 20th, 2016 with an excellent webinar for us from Moderator Amy called Making Learning Fun. So we hope that you'll register with your RELO or local U.S. Embassy and join us in 2016. In this webinar, as you know, you will hear but not see the presenter. And the way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are hundreds of teachers participating, but there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the American English Webinars NING. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems. Unfortunately, we cannot fix individual technical issues, but we will let you know if we are having a global issue. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod. As you know, each webinar series consists of 6 webinars, and they take place every other Wednesday. And if you attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars, you will receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy. To ensure you're eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit it before we request it, or it won't be counted. And we'll give you the link and instructions at the very end of the webinar. You should receive an e-certificate if you attended 4 out of 6 in this series within several weeks from today from your local U.S. Embassy or RELO. If you have not received it after a few weeks, please direct your e-certificate questions to your RELO or local U.S. Embassy. But go ahead and wait for a couple of weeks, because we'll be processing all attendance and confirming all of your records within those next few weeks, so it may take a little bit of time before you receive the certificate. We hope most of you are already familiar with our NING site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join the site. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of our webinar recordings. And this is also where you can ask our presenter questions after the webinar. And now for today's webinar. This session is entitled Make It Meaningful, Bringing Learning to Life with Culturally Relevant Teaching. So sometimes as teachers, we spend so much time focusing on our curriculum and methodology that we forget the most important part of our jobs, the students. By creating a bridge between English and students' backgrounds, knowledge, and experiences, teachers can empower students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically. So today our presenter will discuss ways to increase student motivation and achievement through the use of culturally relevant teaching techniques. She'll show us research-based best practices for teaching diverse language learners, and she will share practical tips and classroom-ready activities for your context. It's my pleasure today to introduce Tabitha Kidwell. Tabitha is a doctoral student in the Applied Linguistics and Language Education program at the University of Maryland in College Park. She has taught French, Spanish, and English to students ranging from preschoolers to adults on 5 continents. Her research and teaching interests include novice teacher education and teacher learning across the lifespan. She also enjoys running and wearing funny hats. So thanks so much for being with us today, Tabitha, and we look forward to hearing all we can.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Katie. Welcome everybody to webinar 1.6 of the American English webinar series. I'm Tabitha, and I am really excited to have all of you join me today for this webinar. I'm currently a PhD student living in Washington, D.C., but I still teach English to adults, and I have taught around the world, including in Madagascar, Peru, India, and Indonesia. So I'm glad to see some people from some of those places here today. So I enjoyed seeing your pre-webinar polls. It looks like about half of you are not familiar yet with the term culturally relevant teaching, which is okay because that's what we'll learn today. I also see that almost all of you do incorporate culture in your classrooms, and almost half of you include local culture. So you may already do culturally relevant teaching and not even know it. The most basic definition I can give is that culturally relevant language teaching means making your instruction match the student's own cultures. That word relevant means closely connected to. So it implies making a connection between your teaching and your students' learning, your students' cultures. It really helps increase student motivation, which is the November theme on the American English website. The goals of this webinar are to explain what culturally relevant teaching is and where the idea comes from, to discuss the advantages of 4 different aspects of culturally relevant teaching, which are relationships, materials, language, and activities, and then to share some practical teaching ideas related to those 4 aspects. So be sure that you have a pen and paper nearby so that you can write some of these ideas down. So first, where does this idea come from? Well, the idea of culturally relevant teaching was developed in the United States in the 1990s. Some of the most important researchers were Gloria Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, and Lisa Delpit. Originally, it focused on improving instruction for African American students, but research has shown that it's a highly effective form of pedagogy for students of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So in the United States, we have a multicultural society. Many of your countries are also multicultural. But in the US, almost half of all school children are Hispanic, Asian, Black, multiracial, or members of another minority group, while the majority of teachers are white. So historically, there has been a large gap between the achievement of minority students and that of white students. And some educators believe this achievement gap may be due to the cultural differences between teachers and students. So culturally relevant teaching developed as a way to close this gap and improve the education of all students. Now in this arrow, you see the abbreviation CRT for culturally relevant teaching, and I might use that abbreviation again. So how does this idea relate to English as a foreign language teaching in a global context? To begin to explain that idea, let's go to the polls. Do you and your students have the same cultural background? What do you say? So far? Okay, that was a brief 100% yes. It looks like most of you, about 80%, have the same cultural background. Going down a little bit, so maybe about three quarters do, and about half do not. Or I'm sorry, about 1/4 does not have the same cultural background. So great, let's go back to the presentation. So we saw that many of you do share the same cultural background as your students. You say about 75% of you. And that's a strength. You have a lot in common that you can build upon. And culturally relevant teaching is effective even in situations where students and teachers have the same background. But even teachers with the same cultural background as their students might have some aspects of a different culture. So students from rural areas often attend schools in large regional towns, and their teachers might be from the cities, so they'll have different origin. Or it might be that students are of a different social class or religious community. Of course, unless you are a very new teacher, you'll have a difference of generation. If anyone has had the experience of listening to teenagers speak about popular culture and you haven't understood most of what they're talking about, then you have experienced this concept of youth culture. So all of those differences between teachers and students can introduce cultural gaps in the classroom. And making efforts to bridge these gaps, even if they're comparatively small, can improve student learning. Now, about a quarter of you also said that you do not share the same cultural background as your students. In our current area of globalization, this is occurring more often. So whether people migrate because of economic reasons or political ones, it can result in situations where teachers work with students of very different backgrounds from their own. When I have taught abroad myself as a foreign native speaker, this has been my experience. I've learned it's really important to learn about the local culture and context to be able to relate to students. So many people want to learn from a native speaker, but the truth is, in many ways, native speakers are not necessarily ideal English teachers, especially given the great divide between their own experiences and that of their students. So often local English teachers know more about the cultures of their students and are better able to match their instruction to students' cultural needs. So I've listed some ways here that students and teachers might vary: origin, social class, religion, generation, interest, language, values. But I'd like your input too. If you can think of other ways that students and teachers might be different, please enter it in the chat box. So in Mexico, they say there is a generation gap. It's a little bit different. What else? So attitude or taste. Students might have different interests. They might see the world different. Oh, gender is an important issue. Sometimes the students that study English are female, and if you are a male teacher, there is a difference there. Also, Sylvia brings up political views. That's an important way that teachers might be different from their students. I see Leticia mentions values. Ray mentions education, prior educational experiences. Vicente mentions social class. That can be a major way that students and teachers are different. Technology, someone says. Intergeri says technology. So youth culture really emphasizes technology, and often older teachers might not know about it. Okay, you guys have so many great ideas here, great responses. Thinking about these differences and building on students' own unique cultural experiences can help strengthen your instruction, improve student motivation, and increase student achievement. So it's important to think about how we can build on these differences and make them strengths. But before we get too far, I want to take a moment to talk about the role of culture in English as a foreign language. To be an effective English teacher, it's important that you balance the teaching of target cultures and the students' own cultures. On this slide, you see examples of pictures showing transportation. This shows how that concept might look different in the target culture and in your students' own cultures. So traditionally, a lot of discussion about culture and language teaching has had to do with teaching the target culture, so British or Australian or American culture. And in the pre-webinar poll, a majority of you said that you do include US culture. This is really important. Students need to know about the cultures of the languages they're speaking so that they can understand cultural references and communicate with native speakers appropriately. The American English website has lots of materials about American culture that can help you do this. But culturally relevant language teaching also focuses on the students' own cultures. So good lessons depend on making the connection between students and the content. And teachers must know students' cultures to be able to do this. I hope that today's webinar will give you some techniques to be able to do this more effectively. So here's every teacher's goal. Good teaching is about connecting the teacher, the content, and the student. If all 3 points of this triangle match up, then everything is in harmony. Students will happily do what the teacher has planned. They will understand the content because the teacher is such an expert, and everyone will learn and will grow from the lesson. But here is where we have traditionally put a lot of our efforts. The teacher is the expert on the content, and it's up to him or her to develop good lessons that communicate the content. So could everyone please raise your hand if you became an English teacher because you yourself have strong language skills? Oh my goodness, it looks like many of you are raising your hands. Great. You can put your hands down, please. It looks like a lot of you have strong content knowledge, and that's a real strength. But this reminds me of a story from my first year of teaching. Like most first-year teachers, I was having a difficult time, and I went to my supervisor's office for advice. She told me, "Tabitha, you should know, you are not actually teaching foreign language." Well, I was shocked. I said, "I'm not? What am I teaching?" And she said to me, "No, you are teaching students." I had been so focused on my content that I had overlooked the importance of building relationships with my students. So that brings me to the first important element of CRT, culturally relevant relationships. If you don't know about your students' lives, it's impossible to incorporate their experiences in your lessons. To be able to match your instruction to students' cultures and backgrounds, you need to know their cultures and backgrounds yourself. And to do that, you have to have a strong relationship in place. So relationships are the foundation for the final side of the triangle, which is the connection between the content and the students. In an English classroom, there are 3 major ways teachers can strengthen this connection. They can select culturally relevant materials, like reading and listening texts that reflect aspects of students' lives. They can teach culturally relevant language, which reflects local linguistic norms. And lastly, teachers can include culturally relevant activities, activities that relate to students' lives outside of school. So these are the 4 aspects of culturally relevant teaching that I'll talk to you about today. For each of them, I'll include some teaching ideas you can use in your classes even tomorrow. By including culturally relevant relationships, materials, language, and activities, you'll help increase student motivation and raise student achievement. So we'll begin by talking about relationship. Let's go to the polls to see how everyone thinks about their relationships with students. Which of these analogies is the best way to think about the relationship between teachers and students? Is it like the relationship between a parent and a child? Between a doctor and a patient? Between a boss and an employee? Or between 2 friends? Let's see. So far, over half of you say it's like the relationship between friends. About a third of you say it's like a parent and a child. Only a few of you think it's like a doctor and a patient. And no one says like a boss and an employee. Very interesting. So let's go back to our presentation. The truth is, all of your answers are correct. Like a parent and a child, the teacher is responsible for the student's safety and growth. Like a doctor, the teacher wants to encourage the students to improve their lives and well-being. Like a boss, the teacher is responsible for students' work and progress towards goals. And like friends, teachers do care about the events happening in their students' lives. But the relationship between teachers and students is also different from all of these. Many teachers are hesitant about the idea of having relationships with students because they take that word to mean friendship. In a lot of contexts around the world, it is not appropriate to be friends with your students. But the student-teacher relationship is different from a friendship. Probably all of you make an effort to build a positive relationship with your supervisors and your colleagues, and you should also work to create a positive relationship with your students. So in order to begin to explain the importance of culturally relevant relationships, I'd like to share a quote by a Native Alaskan teacher. "In order to teach you, I must know you." Now, if you know where Alaska is, please raise your hand. Okay, it looks like a lot of people are raising their hands. You must know American geography. So Alaska is the largest state in the United States, and it is the one that's northwest of Canada. You can put your hands down, please. As you might expect, since Alaska is so far away, the native peoples of Alaska have a very different culture from much of the United States. So many teachers there see the value and need for culturally relevant teaching. To be able to teach students, you need to know who students are, and that depends on relationships. Sometimes that relationship develops naturally, but you probably know examples of times when you did not develop a natural relationship with each student. Sometimes it takes hard work on the teacher's part. So I want to share some research that was conducted by a professor at Harvard named Hunter Gelbach. Now, please raise your hand if you know where Harvard is. I'm sure many of you have heard about Harvard, and it looks like many of you do know where it is. So Harvard is on the east coast of the United States in Boston, and it is a very prestigious university, so you can expect that this research will be well done. Professor Gelbach and his colleagues did a study. They told some students and teachers about things they both had in common. And they compared the progress with students who didn't know about what they had in common with their teacher. And they found that students that knew about what they had in common with their teacher were able to do better in their classes and were able to do better on tests. So they say that means that teachers don't have to rely on a natural spark of chemistry. You can actually engineer and create close relationships on purpose by telling students about what you both have in common. So that's one way to build relationships with students. I'm interested to see what the rest of you do to also create relationships with students. Let's go to the polls. Which of these do you do to help create a positive relationship with students? You can check as many as you would like. Do you spend time outside of class? Are you polite, open, and friendly with students? Do you try to learn about youth culture? Do you give students a survey to learn more about them? Do you use get-to-know-you activities at the beginning of class? Or is there something else that you do as well? I'll be interested to hear about that other category after we talk about all this. But this is great. So I'm noting down what you all are saying so that I can comment on it. Good to see that you do so many things to get to know your student. So let's go back to the presentation. It looks like about 30% of you try to spend time with your students outside of class. And that is a great way to build relationships. If your students participate in sports, music, or drama, you can go to their performances or games. Many teachers also spend time with students in an English club or a movie or a music club. And if you don't have a lot of free time, you can just spend time at school before and after class talking to students. Try to get to your classroom early so you have time to do that. Now, almost all of you said that you are polite, open, and friendly with students, which is very important. You really want to do everything you can to avoid embarrassing a student. If you embarrass them, it will be very difficult to build a relationship later. So if you need to discipline a student, I suggest you talk to them about their behavior privately. Always treat students how you would want someone to treat you or how you'd want them to treat your own child. So about 20% of you said that you try to learn about youth culture. You ask students about the music they listen to, the TV shows they watch, the social media they use, the movie stars they like. This is a great thing to do because it will help you continue to feel young yourself. So you can tell people that teaching is the fountain of youth. A good number of you said that you give students a survey. This is something I always do at the beginning of classes I teach. I ask students about what they do in their free time, their favorite movies, TV shows, music, celebrities, etc. And then I read them and I make a list of one thing that I want to try to talk to each student about. And then I try to meet students to talk about these things before or after class. Sometimes I walk around the school before class starts so that I can bump into students and have these conversations. But I try to have one personal conversation with each student in the first couple of months of school. Once I've done that, I cross their name off my list. I think doing this helps students see that I care about them as individuals. Of course, this is really difficult if you have very large classes, but it's worth a try. It will have a positive impact on the students that you can talk to. So if you'd like more motivation or more information about generating student motivation through student interest questionnaires and surveys, check out the Teacher's Corner on the American English website. They have a great article about that this month. So the final suggestion is to use getting to know you activities. About 45% of you said you did this. So taking time to build relationships at the beginning of a class helps you teach more effectively later. So it really is an investment worth making. When you do these activities, I encourage you to be more deliberate about using these activities to show students what you, as the teacher, have in common with them, like the researchers from Harvard suggest. So in a moment, I'm going to share an example activity you could use to do that. But first, I'd like to hear in the chat box about some of your other answers. What are other ways that you build relationships with students? I saw that one teacher said she has lunch with her students. I think that's a great way to meet students. A cookie break. That sounds very exciting. I know I would come to that. Sophia in Romania, I think, says show interest in their lives. Be friends in social network. Definitely, if your students are on Facebook or Twitter or any social networks, you can meet them on there since they're already there so often. Gergana says sing their favorite songs. That's a great suggestion that might come up later in this webinar. Someone said playing basketball. Someone at the ACC in Niger says visiting somewhere together. Someone in Guadalupe says meeting parents. Visiting students' houses is a great way to make connections with their families. I am so glad to see all of these ideas you guys have. I hope that you'll share some of these ideas on the Ning so that you can all continue to learn from each other because you've got a lot of great ideas here. So now for my example activity. This is called Find Someone Like You. For this activity, step 1 is having students write a number of sentences about themselves. Advanced students can write more sentences and they can write more complicated sentences, but you can use this activity even with beginners, like in this example here. Step 2 is that students stand up and practice speaking by asking other students if their sentences are true for them as well. So this student would ask, do you like French fries? Do you play volleyball? They'll continue until they find someone who says yes. Step 3 is that when another student says yes, they write a sentence about that student. For example, Leah likes French fries too. Juan plays volleyball too. The first student to find someone who has each sentence in common with them is the winner of the game. And that's the end of the activity in class. But to get the most out of this activity, Your work as a teacher is not done yet. We want to show students what they have in common with their teachers, not just with other students. So you should collect students' papers and comment on them, like step 4 here. Here, the teacher also plays volleyball. Hopefully you can find something you have in common with each student. Then you'll return the papers to students so they can see what they have in common with their teacher. You could even make a list, like I do with my surveys, and try to talk to every student about what you have in common. That would be a great way to start making relationships at the beginning of the semester or school year. So knowing about your students and showing them what they have in common with you is the first step in enacting CRT. Once you know about students' backgrounds, you can start to adapt your teaching materials to match students' cultures. Before we talk about that, I have a poll for you. This is about the materials you use. Which of these would describe your textbooks? Are they internationally produced that show the target culture, so American or British or Australian culture? Are they locally produced that show your students' culture? Are they outdated that show culture that isn't even relevant anymore? Or are you not even working from a textbook? So it looks like a lot of you are using internationally produced textbooks. A good group is using locally produced textbooks. And very few of you either have outdated textbooks or no textbooks. So that's good to hear. It sounds like you guys have good materials. So let's go back to our presentation. So if you answered B, that 18 or 20% of you, great. You already have materials that show students' culture. You just need to think about how to build on that connection. And if you answered A or C or D, it's up to you to add in cultures that show students' culture, or add in materials that show students' cultures. But you have an even bigger opportunity because it's up to you and you can really make good materials that match your culture. So here are some examples of culturally relevant materials from the pre-webinar article that was posted on the Ning. It was called Integrating Indigenous Cultures into English Language Teaching by Susan Barfield and Joelle Uzarski. So they describe some great ways to bring in culturally relevant materials from diverse cultures around the world, including Tibetan prayer flags, African beads, Maori tattoos, and traditional storytelling. So I suggest that you read it if you haven't yet. Culturally relevant materials are really important because it's unmotivating for students to always be seeing examples from cultures that are very different from their own experiences. So for that 70% of you that have internationally produced textbooks, if your students are only reading Greek or Roman myths, or British novels, or American poetry, there's a disconnect there. And if all of your examples in the textbook are about John and Mary, 2 American students in California, that's a problem too. So I'd like to show an example of a culturally relevant video. This is from East Timor and it teaches English idioms. I'd like to especially thank English language fellow Joni Andress, the U.S. Embassy in Dili, and the Access Micro Scholarship students there, because they produced this video and were willing to share it with us all. So let's take a look.
How are you doing?
Good. What about you?
I'm doing well. Are you coming from class?
Yeah, that's right. I just finished the class.
Okay, what class?
Mathematics.
Mathematics. That's important.
Great.
Felice, could you help me buy a rooster?
Are you sure? It could open up. can of warm with your neighbors. Roasters sprout every day.
That's a good point, but I'm sure I could butter them up.
Okay, well, if you're sure the best place to buy a roaster is at the market, I have some time to kill, so let's go.
All right, okay, let's go. Rooster, what do you think about that one?
I think it's okay, but I think I would get this one instead. It's the top of the line.
Yeah, you're right. Matt, thanks for helping find the perfect rooster. I am tickled pink about that one right there.
No problem.
Language notes. Open a can of worms. A situation that contains many unexpected and unwanted problems and consequences. The company's management thought their new policy would increase employee productivity, but instead it opened a whole new can of worms. His situation is completely messed up. It's a can of worms that I'm happy not to have.
All of the idioms that they used. If you want to watch the rest or if you want to use it in class, you can find it on the Ning. But that was a great example of a culturally relevant material because it showed examples of students' own lives. It shows schools, clothing, transportation, shopping experiences that are familiar to many of the students in East Timor and maybe to some of your students too. So seeing examples of their own lives helps students be more actively involved and helps them see that English can be important day to day. They can see symbols and images that they recognize, and that helps strengthen their prior knowledge connections and makes learning easier. This also builds on student self-esteem. It shows them that their personal experiences are important. Now, if you don't have access to materials in English that match your local culture, you might have to make these materials yourself, but that can present a great opportunity because you can have your students make the materials. For example, if your textbook has students reading an American folktale, you could build on that by having students rewrite the folktale as if it were happening in your town, or even rewrite a folktale from their own culture into English. Do you have other ideas? If so, please put them in the chat box. What are some culturally relevant materials that you have made? Let's see. So Salvador in Mexico says realia. Maybe Helen in Mexico, they use local celebrations. A lot of great ideas. Fernando says photos. Of course, students can take photos of their day-to-day life and use that to talk about it in English. What else? Marisol says holidays. Definitely speaking about local holidays or traditional holidays is a really relevant way to have your students practice English. Farida says selfies. Everybody loves taking selfies. So students can take a selfie that incorporates youth culture, and then they can write about those selfies or talk about them. And one last example from Javier is folktales. So every culture has its own interesting folktales, and those can be told and shared in English. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas. Again, please do share them on the Ning with each other. Now, I want to share an idea with you guys, and this is something I've always enjoyed doing with students. It's rewriting the lyrics of famous pop songs. So the first step is to choose a song that all your students know and love. The best way to do this is to ask them about what they like. You can do this activity with a song originally in English or with a song in your native language. If it is in your native language, you can have students translate it to English. That might be challenging because the words need to match the beats in the song, but that helps students start to experiment with language. If your song is already in English, you can ask students to imagine that the singer's from their own culture and then have them rewrite the lyrics as if that were true. And then you'll have students perform for the class. So let's do an example together. I selected the song We Are the Champions by Queen because I think many people know it worldwide. If you use this song in class, you could have students rewrite the whole song, but for now, we're just going to do this one line. Let's listen to the song. Okay, great. I think a lot of you know that song. Great. So now I'll share an example. So I live in Washington, D.C., and there is a lot of traffic in Washington, D.C. Every day people complain about the traffic. So if I were to rewrite this song about life in Washington, D.C., maybe I would write this. We're stuck in traffic in D.C., and we'll be stuck in this traffic jam till lunchtime. Now, my apologies for my bad singing voice. I wish that we could hear all of your singing voices. I'm sure they are better than mine. But what we can do is have you share your lyrics in the chat box. So please take a minute to fill in the blanks or rewrite these lyrics about life in your city, region, or country. If you're in a viewing session, you can share your lyrics with each other now or maybe at the end of the webinar. And if you're alone, you can just share them in the chat box. So I already see some. Oh no, Marco and Prue says, we are at risks on the streets, my pals. Marco, be careful. Herberto in Colombia says, we are Colombians and we are nice. So maybe that's great. Oh, I like Adalberto in Mexico. We are in our webinar. And that's very culturally responsive to our experience now. Claudia Acero in Colombia says, we are the humans who could save my world. That's great, Claudia. I hope that you do. And we'll keep on, oh, let's see. Helen in Mexico says, we are the students, my friends, and we'll keep on studying till the end. One more. Natalia in Kyrgyzstan says, and we will climb to the top until we win. Great lyrics. So it looks like you guys have had a lot of fun doing this. I'd like to say thank you to everyone sharing your lyrics. I learned a little bit more about life in your countries. And I think that your students would enjoy the opportunity to learn or to write about their own life experiences as well. Great. So now let's talk about the role of language in culturally relevant teachers, in culturally relevant teaching. So for those of you who already read the article posted on the Ning called To Teach Standard English or World Englishes, A Balanced Approach to Instruction by Thomas Farrell and Sonia Martin, you already have some idea of what I will talk about here. And if you haven't read it yet, I suggest that you do. In the past, English as a foreign language teachers have typically taught some form of standard English, and that usually meant British, North American, or Australian English. So bringing culturally relevant language into the English as a foreign language classroom is built on the idea of world Englishes, or the idea that there are other varieties of English that are also valid, such as Indian English in India or Singlish in Singapore. Language is an important part of identity, and including students' own language patterns in English class helps them see that their own experiences are valued. If you overemphasize standard English, you're requiring all students to conform to a native speaker model. And that's really unfair because they'll never be able to become a native speaker. So the key here, again, is balance between standard English and local English. In many contexts, students will be required to show mastery of standard English on their exams. So it's really important that teachers continue to teach standard English. But I suggest that teachers balance this by supporting the use of local English as well. Doing so can help students become more confident and motivated to learn. It also helps students build their linguistic awareness and learn about their own culture. So let me share some examples. My first example is greetings. I'd like you guys to put in the chat box what standard English speakers usually say to greet each other. What is a standard English greeting? Let's see. What do you say? Hello, hello. How are you? Hi, hi, good morning. Nice to meet you. Hello, what's up? How do you do? Okay, good. You guys clearly are experts on standard English. Typically, standard English speakers say, hello, how are you? But the truth is, unless we're close friends, or if something important or upsetting has happened, we don't really want to know how the other person is. We're expecting them to say, I'm fine, thank you, and move on. So it's really a kind of silly thing to say. So now I'd like you to please enter into the chat box a translation in English of the way that people typically greet each other in your culture. So for example, when I lived in Indonesia, people would say, where are you going? Or have you eaten? I've heard that in a lot of places worldwide, it's appropriate to begin a conversation by asking about people's families. So let's see. What do you say in your culture? Oh my goodness. Okay, so Jules in Senegal says, are you in peace? And then many of you are saying things that I can't say because they're in other languages. So some of you, I know the phrase salam. What else? That's interesting. What else? So you have a lot of different ways that you greet each other. When you teach greetings, you could teach both the standard English greeting and a translation of whatever it is you say locally, and you could discuss the differences. In the article on the Ning, Farrell and Martin also point out that in many Muslim countries, like Qatar, it's appropriate to greet fellow Muslims in Arabic and use phrases like Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you, if you'll excuse my Arabic pronunciation. So that's an example of a key phrase that's used so often in the local context that it doesn't really need to be translated to English. If everyone can understand the meaning locally, that's fine. So encouraging students to continue to use the local linguistic norms, that can help make your students more comfortable speaking English. Another example is norms related to public speaking. For example, Japanese students have sometimes struggled to write speeches in their English classes because the norms of standard English would require the speaker to be very explicit in developing a line of thinking. So even you're supposed to state facts that are obvious to everyone in the room. In Japanese culture, if everybody already knows something, it's considered rude to tell them what they already know. So the Japanese students, because of their culture, didn't want to say something too obvious or be too direct for fear of offending the audience. Maybe some of you have similar cultural beliefs about public speaking in your culture. If so, you could teach the local norms and explain how standard English norms are different. Another example is indirectness. When I was first living in Madagascar, I found that people were giving me a lot of nice stuff. I would compliment them on their hat or their bag, and then they would try to give it to me. So I learned later that saying, I really like it, is an indirect way of saying, I want it in the local culture. I was horrified to learn this, and I stopped giving so many compliments so that my generous friends could keep their belongings. But this is an example of the ways that norms about directness or indirectness might differ in your local linguistic context. One last example is idiomatic expressions. And really, a lot of the greetings that you're sharing, like asking, how is your wife? How is your kids? How are your kids? How is your health? Those are really examples of idiomatic expressions. But in the article on the Ning, Farrell and Martin share an example from Dutch English. In Dutch English, shopkeepers say, if you need help, just pull the bell. Whereas in Standard English, we might say, if you need help, just let me know. If all of your students speak Dutch English, you don't need to correct the speaker to use Standard English. The most important thing here is communication. And if that happens using local linguistic norms, that's fine. So my suggestion overall here is that you be open to a small change of mindset. Because many of you must teach Standard English for the national curriculum or for national exams, you don't want to totally forget about Standard English. But incorporating local English can have very positive effects for your students' comfort and motivation. If you'd like to read more about non-native English speakers and local English, the moderators have posted some more resources about this on the Ning. So that brings me to the final component of culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant activities. Now, I am sometimes guilty of this myself. But sometimes English teachers plan activities like, pretend you're a doctor. What would you say to your patient? Now, that might be a good activity to give advice and use modal verbs like should, but unless you're teaching English for specific purposes to nurses or doctors, it doesn't really relate to most students' lives. If teachers can plan activities that are similar to what students do in their lives outside of school, it helps to build a bridge of meaningfulness between home and school experiences. Students need to learn knowledge and skills that they can actually apply in their lives. For example, reading a video game blog or reading a recipe. And every student needs to have some experience of success in your class. Including many different types of activities like music, art, or physical movement helps students who have different multiple intelligences feel as successful as students who really excel at language use. And that can be a big motivator. Students are more motivated to engage in an activity once they can see the relevance of what they're doing. So one idea is to incorporate youth culture into your classroom by asking students to use genres that they're very familiar with, like emails, text messages, tweets, or status updates. You could start every class with students writing and orally sharing a short status update if your students love Facebook. Or you can teach English texting abbreviations like LOL and TTYL and have students write short text messages to each other in English, either on their phones or just on small pieces of paper that they pass to each other. Another idea is to let students provide the relevance by using open questions that allow students to talk about things that are open to them or that are interesting to them. So the article on the Ning called Cultural Introductions by Way of Storytelling by Matthew Jellick is a great example of how you could do this. I suggest that you give that article a read. Matthew gives his students stories that they complete about their own lives, and it sounds like his students really enjoy the activity. As much as possible, rather than telling students to write about some strange topic, you can have them write about what they know best, themselves and their own lives. They will definitely be interested in this and motivated to write. And a last idea is to build lessons around student choice. I'm going to expand on the pretend you're a doctor example that I mentioned earlier to show how this might look. So if you want students to practice giving advice and using the modal verb should, Rather than requiring all students to pretend to be a doctor and write advice to your patients, you can provide additional options that relate to student interests. So students who like to play football can write suggestions about how to get in better shape. Students who like fashion can write about what people should and should not wear. Students who are passionate about the environment can write about what people should do to avoid pollution. And students who just like spending time with friends can write about how to be a good friend. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. We've talked about ways you can improve your teaching and increase student motivation by building culturally relevant relationships, using culturally relevant materials, teaching culturally relevant language, and engaging in culturally relevant activities. I hope that you got some ideas that you'll be able to use in your classes. But before we go, I have just one last question for you. Please take a moment to write down at least one idea that you want to try in your classroom. If you are watching in a viewing group, please share with your group what activity you'll use. And if you're on your own, you can type your answer in the chat box for everyone to see. It looks like Nadina will try the activity with the survey. I hope you talk to all of your students about what you have in common, Nadina. Many of you enjoyed the song and rewriting songs, which I think is a great and fun activity. Some of you like the rooster video. Maybe you'll show that video to your students, or you could make your own video showing idioms in English in your own local context. All right, I see someone says getting to know each other activities. It looks like you guys are going to take away a lot of these activities. I hope that you enjoy them and that you share them with friends. And it really was a pleasure to be able to share them with you. I also look forward to seeing some of your ideas about all this on the Ning. So I really enjoyed being in the webinar with you guys. I look forward to hearing about how culturally relevant teaching works for you. So don't forget about the post-webinar discussion on the Ning. And you can also follow me on Twitter. Best of luck, and I hope that you all have a great remainder of your day or evening.
Thanks so much, Tabitha, for sharing some great ideas with us today about how we can connect with our students and bridge cultural gaps to ensure that our instruction is relevant and meaningful for our students' lives. And we'd like to thank you, our webinar audience, for your active participation and thoughtful consideration of the ideas presented today